Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. Andrew Bacevich about his book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. Dr. Bacevich is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. He's the author of numerous books, including Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, and the book we're discussing today, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and several other prominent publications. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-middle-east. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks very much.
Well, thanks for joining us. So let's get started with a very brief overview of your book, as well as what you mean when you say the Greater Middle East.
Okay. The subtitle of the book is A Military History, and that's what I mean it to be, an account of U.S. military involvement in the Greater Middle East since 1980. 1980 is the start date of my narrative, because that's the day when the year that Jimmy Carter promulgated what we today call the Carter Doctrine, a statement that, in my judgment, inaugurated the militarization of U.S. policy in the Islamic world. I mean, to focus a little bit on that, prior to 1980, the United States was willing to fight for Western Europe, and it was willing to fight for East Asia. Indeed, had fought two wars in East Asia, Korea and Vietnam. Prior to 1980, there was really little thought given to the possibility of U.S. forces fighting anywhere in the Islamic world. Of course, what we've seen since 1980 is that U.S. military involvement there has become continuous. And so my book tries to tell the story of how that happened and what that military involvement has resulted in. Now, Carter's initial statement referred to the Persian Gulf, and indicating that defending the Persian Gulf had become a vital U.S. national security interest. What ensued, of course, was U.S. military involvement over a far broader field of play, extending in the east as far as Afghanistan and Pakistan, extending in the west all the way across Africa, and the identifying the element of these countries is that all of them either have a Muslim majority population or a population that's a Muslim plurality. And it seemed to me that a useful term to describe this region of U.S. military involvement was Greater Middle East, and that's why I chose it.
So what changed in 1980? Obviously, the U.S. had some involvement in the Middle East, I guess primarily through covert means. But what happened in 1980 that would result not only in the U.S. getting involved with Operation Eagle Claw, but the U.S. remaining involved basically every year for the following 36 years and probably even beyond that, well into the future?
Yeah, and the way you pose the question makes a very important point. It is certainly not my argument that the United States ignored the Middle East prior to 1980, had no interest, had no policy. Certainly we were involved in a variety of ways, diplomatically, economically, using covert operations. For example, in 1953, when we along with the Brits, overthrew the Mossadegh regime in Iran. But prior to 1980, if you went to the safe containing war plans in the Pentagon, you wouldn't have found any war plans that proposed to have major U.S. military intervention anywhere in the Islamic world. Beginning in 1980, that changes. Well, what was it that led Carter to promulgate the Carter Doctrine? A variety of factors coming together. One of them was the fact that 1980 was a presidential election year. President Carter very much hoped to win a second term, but he was a vulnerable incumbent. He was a vulnerable incumbent because of a very poorly performing U.S. economy, and he was blamed for that. And also he was blamed for events beyond U.S. borders that made him appear to be a weak president. Two important examples of those events were the Iranian Revolution, which had overthrown the Shah, our man in Tehran, and brought to power a vociferously anti-American revolutionary regime, rightly or wrongly. Carter was blamed for that. And then in December 1979, the month before he enunciated the Carter Doctrine, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, we know today that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan not because they were on the march, but because actually they were fearful that developments in Afghanistan were going to undermine the Soviet Empire. But the perception at the time in Washington was that by intervening in Afghanistan, this was evidence of Soviet aggressive intentions, and that after Afghanistan, they'd head on into Iran, and ultimately they'd take over the entire Persian Gulf. That was never in the cards. It was never going to happen. But that wasn't the perception at the time. So we've got a convergence of foreign events, domestic events, that lead Carter to make this broad statement. I'd emphasize, I don't think Carter, I'm certain that Carter had little understanding of the implications of that statement. But one of the most important implications was that from that point forward, the national security apparatus begins to think about intervening in the region with U.S. military forces. We begin to write those war plans. We begin to create headquarters. We begin to negotiate overflight rights and basing rights. We begin to undertake exercises to prepare U.S. forces to operate in that environment. So he sets in motion a process which leads to what has become really a condition of permanent war.
Yeah, so since you mentioned the Soviets, how did their dissolution and the end of the Cold War change U.S. policy in regards to the Middle East? Now, obviously, 1980 precedes this by about a decade, but contained within the 36 years since, that was a pretty major event. So what changed as a result of that?
Well, two things, I think. During the 1980s, as had been the case in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, the principal focus of U.S. forces, the principal rationale for the U.S. military establishment was to contain the Soviet Union. So when the Cold War ends, 1989, 1990, it finds, in essence, has become a vast surplus of military power. And bureaucracies being bureaucracies, when the initial rationale for your existence goes away, there's an incentive to go find some other reason for your continued existence. So the end of the Cold War, in a sense, frees the national security apparatus now to pay more attention to events in the greater Middle East. But the other factor, also relevant here, is that when the Cold War ended, there were many within the United States who interpreted that the conclusion of the Cold War as a great victory won by the United States and attributed to Soviet recognition that there was no way that they were going to be able to keep up with U.S. military power. In other words, even without a shot being fired, this was perceived to be a military victory and a sign of U.S. military supremacy, a conviction that then is immediately reinforced by the events of Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The bottom line is, as the United States makes this transition from the Cold War, leading to ever greater involvement in the greater Middle East, it does so with many in Washington, many in the media, having come to the conclusion that U.S. military power was simply unstoppable, and therefore that it had become a usable instrument to begin, using the term that people in Washington use, to undertake to shape the greater Middle East consistent with U.S. interests. During the Cold War, mostly we'd used military power to contain the Soviets. After the Cold War, particularly in the Islamic world, there's a belief that military power can be a shaping instrument, and therefore it ought to be put to use.
Right, even though it's largely been unsuccessful in that way.
Well, bingo. I mean, in many respects, that's the bottom line of my account. Chapter by chapter, my book describes interventions undertaken by each administration, from that of Jimmy Carter down to President Obama. Some of those interventions are very brief and small. For example, the bombing attack of Libya under President Reagan's administration. U.S. aircraft were in Libyan airspace for something like a total of 10 minutes. Some of those interventions end up being protracted. The Iraq War of 2003-2011, which is now resumed with yet another Iraq War. But the bottom line is that whatever we've tried to do, with whatever justification, have proven to be counterproductive. And I think that's a conclusion that's pretty relevant to the present moment as we try to figure out how to go forward and whether to continue this war or whether it's time for us to consider policy alternatives.
Right. So what changed that it's gone from shorter military interventions like the 86 bombing in Libya that you mentioned, or the involvement in Lebanon in 83, or in Somalia in the mid-90s, these shorter military interventions, to now where we have these long, drawn-out wars that span over a decade? What changed to go from the shorter interventions to the longer interventions?
Well, I think the key there is to understand the impact of 9/11 on U.S. policy and on the expectations of what American military power was going to do. The people around George W. Bush at the time of the 9/11 attacks were themselves particularly enamored with what they perceived to be the capabilities of the U.S. military. And I'm referring here to people like Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz. They really were true believers in this notion that nothing could stop the U.S. military. And so in response to 9/11, while after quickly overthrowing the Taliban in Afghanistan, alas, not really bringing that war to a successful conclusion, they shifted their attention to Iraq, a nation that had nothing to do with 9/11, and promoted the preventive war against Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein. That war was justified by claims that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction. I think the actual purpose of the Iraq War was that the architects of U.S. policy, George W. Bush's principal advisors, really believed that we possessed the military capacity to pretty much transform the entire region, with Iraq simply as a start point. And so my point here is that they recognized that the Iraq War was going to be a pretty big war, but they thought it would be a brief war. They thought it would end in a decisive victory, and they miscalculated. And in that miscalculation, they plunged us into a war which, for all practical purposes, has never ended. And indeed, because they shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq before Afghanistan was properly won, the George W. Bush administration then also created this second protracted war. So we've had these we've had these two very long wars that have been going. Each has been going now for well over a decade. Each the longest war in our history. Why? They thought they could win quickly. They miscalculated.
No, they definitely did. But one thing that's often associated with conflict in the Middle East is oil. So what role have oil interests played in the U.S.'s military involvement in the greater Middle East over the last 36 or so years?
Well, back in 1980, again, going back to when Carter started everything off, there was a strong perception, and not an incorrect perception, that the American way of life was tied to our ability to continue to import large quantities of oil, with the Persian Gulf, of course, being the principal reservoir of oil on a global basis. At least it seemed at that point. I mean, remember, in 1980, the amount of oil being produced by oil fields in North America was declining. All the smart people said that we were pretty much tapped out in our ability here in North America to produce oil and natural gas. And so it appeared that oil was necessary if we were going to sustain our abundance and sustain our way of life. That said, I argue that the ambitions that drove U.S. policy, even back in the 1980s, went beyond simply the concrete interest in oil. That in some respects, the ultimate driver is our insistence, our collective insistence that we are a people who don't have to accept limits, and in many respects, that moment when it appeared that we were going to be increasingly dependent upon foreign oil seemed to be a situation in which the United States was facing limits, constraints for the first time in its history. And so the war for the greater Middle East is a way of pushing back at that possibility of sustaining our claim to being a people to whom limits do not apply.
Okay, and what role has the U.S.'s rather unique relationship with Israel played in its military involvement in the greater Middle East?
Well, I don't think it's been central. Israel plays a role in the narrative as it unfolds. I think people have forgotten, for example, that in one of Ronald Reagan's interventions in the region, the peacekeeping intervention in Lebanon that lasts from 1982 to 1984, the centerpiece being the Beirut bombing of October 1983 that kills so many U.S. Marines. Israel was a de facto adversary in that operation. The argument is made by some, and I'll just lay it out because it's an argument I disagree with. The argument is made by some that, in essence, U.S. policy in the region simply is a way of doing the bidding of Israel or the bidding of the Israel lobby. I certainly agree that the Israel lobby has great influence on U.S. policy, and I think the influence, by and large, is unfortunate. But it's not as if Israel or the Israel lobby are somehow determining U.S. policy. I think U.S. policy has been driven by, as you suggested a few minutes ago, concerns about energy. I think it's been driven, as I suggested a couple of minutes ago, about our sense of who we are, our role in history, our responsibilities, our prerogatives, and only to a much lesser extent is it driven by concerns for the security of Israel.
Well, and it also seems to be driven by concerns about so-called terrorism. Now, this is something that is especially picked up in the post-9/11 world, where U.S. policy seems to be based off of the terrorist events of 9/11.
Right.
But what role did the U.S. play in sort of creating this terrorist threat via these military interventions and the ensuing blowback? And then how have we seen this terrorism play a role in shaping U.S. policy?
Well, it would certainly be wrong to argue that if the greater Middle East is in a mess right now, I think it'd be wrong to argue that the United States is primarily responsible for creating that mess. The historical roots of the disorder and dysfunction that we see in evidence today really are pretty deep. I mean, they can be traced to divisions within Islam. They can be traced to ill-advised European colonial adventurism. They can be traced to unenlightened local leaders who have consistently failed to put in place programs of genuine development. So there's a host of factors involved here. But it's also true that I think the United States has contributed to the problem and has made matters worse. Earlier, I referred to the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh, in which we were involved. In retrospect, what a reckless and foolish act for us to have undertaken. And I think also more recently, the U.S. military interventions that I describe in my book have either been ineffective or, in many cases, have produced unanticipated but hugely negative consequences. And I think the existence of ISIS is a very good example of that. For all the terrible things we can say about Saddam Hussein, and we can say lots of terrible things about him, while he governed Iraq, there was no significant problem of violent radical Islamism in that country. He kept a lid on things. Well, we invaded Iraq in 2003. We shattered the country. We opened the doors to chaos and anarchy, and radical jihadists got their chance. In Iraq, they first appeared as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We enjoyed some success in suppressing that organization, but ISIS really is a successor to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it is not wrong to say that ISIS would not exist had not the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. So we're not fault for everything by any means, but we've got our fingerprints on a lot of things right now over there, and what we did is mostly unfortunate.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, the U.S. has been so heavily involved over the last few decades, as we've been discussing, that there are going to be direct consequences of that. But I think it's a great point that you make, that there are some underlying tensions that go back hundreds, even thousands of years. And while the U.S. has definitely done done some things to provoke those tensions, there are some underlying fundamental issues that exist in that region, regardless of whether the U.S. is involved as heavily as it is or not.
Yes, and of course, by extension, taking on board the deep-seated roots of the disorder in the region makes it all the more unlikely that U.S. military involvement is going to provide some kind of a shortcut to a solution. I mean, there's that cliche that there is no military solution to, situation X, Y, or Z. Well, there certainly is no military solution that we can conceive of that is going to alleviate the disorder and the dysfunction that is so much in evidence.
Yeah, so while it might not be possible to provide a full solution to this entire issue, are there any steps that you would recommend be taken to work towards a solution, or that might improve the situation?
Well, I think, the start point for U.S. policy needs to be what can we do that serves the interests of the American people, that can provide for the security, the prosperity of this country. that's the same question that the rulers of Great Britain should be asking, and of any other country you can name. And I think that the beginning of wisdom is to recognize that the so-called terrorist threat is not great to us. I know people are currently wringing their hands about ISIS. And ISIS, I don't mean to trivialize ISIS, but let's face it. It's probably 30,000 fighters. They've got no air force, no navy, no weapons of mass destruction, no significant resource base, no allies, and they're about 7,000 miles away from us. So the notion that ISIS poses an existential threat to the United States is silly. What's the best way to defend against ISIS? For us to defend against ISIS is to erect effective defenses, to keep bad guys out. And that means ensuring that our internal security agencies are well-led and well-resourced. We're talking about the FBI, the TSA, Border Security, Coast Guard, and the like. We can't eliminate the possibility of terrorism striking on our shores, but we can reduce it, we can control it, and that should be the first step. With regard to the region itself, I think that the real focus of U.S. policy should be to get powers in the region for whom ISIS does pose an existential threat, get them to step up to the plate and cooperate with one another in order to address that common threat. If Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and Turkey and Egypt were to make common cause against ISIS, I believe they could handle that. Now, making common cause against ISIS means that they would first have to set aside, at least temporarily, the gripes that those countries have with one another. And I know that that's not necessarily easy, but it can be done. In World War II, facing the common threat of Nazi Germany, democratic capitalist United States, Marxist, Leninist, Soviet Union, imperialist Great Britain set aside differences and to focus on the destruction of Germany. So I think the diplomatic task facing the United States is to get countries in the region to take ownership for problems that are rightly theirs, because our efforts to solve that problem, our past military interventions, have tended to produce outcomes other than those that we wanted.
So beyond a diplomatic involvement, do you think there is a role for the U.S. to play in the Middle East?
Yeah, again, what do we want? What we want is for the Middle East to not be a source of anti-American, anti-Western violence. What we want is the restoration of some sort of stability that may, over time, lead to this part of the world becoming liberal, becoming democratic, embracing modernity. But I don't think that that's something we can coerce. I think rather that through patient exchanges, that educational exchanges, cultural exchanges, maybe we can help to reduce the perception held by some people in that region, reduce the perception that we're the enemy. Try to demonstrate that there's nothing inherently antagonistic in the United States, that we can represent a society where faith and modernity can be reconciled. Because I think ultimately what has to happen in large parts of the Islamic world is to bring about some reconciliation between their faith and the forces of modernity.
All right, and one final topic I want to look at before we wrap up, and that's superpower politics. Now, we discussed this a little bit as relates to the U.S. and the Soviet Union before the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it seems like there's a lot of rhetoric and maybe some reality to it that China and Russia are emerging on the global stage. So do you think the emergence of China and Russia as bigger global powers, if in fact that comes to pass, will affect U.S. policy in the greater Middle East, and if it does, how would it?
Well, I don't believe that Russia deserves to be in the ranks of first order powers. President Obama a couple of years ago referred to Russia as a regional power. I think it's about right. They're not insignificant. but they're no longer the global power they were back in the days of the USSR. Shouldn't be ignored, but also we shouldn't overreact to the mischiefs that they can perform. China, I think, is a different story. So too, actually, is India. There is forming a new international order that will not be the unipolar order that some people fancied would exist as a result of the end of the Cold War. In other words, we are going to continue to be the most powerful country in the world for a long, long time, but we are not going to be the sole superpower. And so the great challenge of the 21st century, far more important than the question of how to restore order to the Middle East, the great challenge is to figure out how to create a multipolar order where all of the major powers can tolerate one another, where there's some, not world peace, but at least mutual coexistence. And probably the most challenging part of doing that is to find a way for the United States and China to agree on how to share the planet. And I think that's, frankly, that's just a much tougher question and a more important question than ongoing events in the Middle East.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you for joining me today. What are the best ways to follow your work, and is there anything else you'd like to say to promote your book?
Well, I mean, I welcome anybody who takes a look at the book. I'm glad to hear from them. I don't have a website or anything, but I welcome people's comments. I'll give you my email address. It's just my last name, BACEV, like Victor, ICH, at BU, that's for Boston University, at BU.edu. Welcome any comments people may have.
Okay, well, great. And I want to encourage everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-middle-east. And of course, we'll link to the book. And again, the title of the book is America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-middle-east is the show notes page for this episode. And in addition to linking to that book, we'll link to Washington Rules and a few other resources. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-middle-east is the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcatcher so you can stay up to date on what's going on with the show and not miss an episode. And also to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast if that is your preferred way of keeping up with things. And Andrew, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss this very interesting book and all these interesting topics, and hopefully we can talk with you again sometime soon.
Thanks very much for having me on.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.